Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 10 in MKT 561 Services Marketing, where I'll talk about today customer satisfaction and service quality, sort of the bedrocks of services marketing. So, in any service organisation, marketing is really responsible for three important functions, and this includes related to customer satisfaction and service quality. Designing the service product or the service that meets the target customer's needs, wants and expectations, communicating this to the market, and monitoring and controlling the service delivery systems to ensure the customer continues to be satisfied. So if you want to think of how services marketing might differ from product marketing, because services are processes which involve both front and back of house people, there's obviously a very important role for services marketing to manage the entire service process here. So let's start with what drives the kind of service that people would like, which is their expectations. Now, there are a number of different types of expectations people can have with a service. You may be thinking of what makes a perfect service: a perfect holiday, a perfect wedding, a perfect birthday, a perfect lunch, and we call these desired or ideal expectations. We can also have what's called normative expectations, and these are should-be expectations. I expect that my phone call will be answered in 30 seconds, which is an expectation people have with call centres. I expect that my assignment will be returned on time. I expect that I'll get service from an ambulance within 5 to 10 minutes. So these are what we call normative expectations. We can have also expectations based on experience. So based on my previous service encounter with this restaurant and similar types of organisations at this price range, I expect this level of service. There are also what we might call adequate or acceptable expectations, a minimum tolerable expectation. Minimum internet speed that I have on my plan, minimum waiting time or maximum waiting time, what I will actually put up with. And so these can also drive expectations. So a consumer can have one of these types of expectations, often very difficult for the service marketer to know which ones we're talking about. Now, related to, of course, is what we call the zone of tolerance, or ZOT. And different customers will process different zones of tolerance. Why? Because their expectations and their perceptions of service will differ. As your involvement with service attributes, this will change the zone of tolerance. So somebody who has had a lot of involvement with dentistry or a lot of involvement with medical services will have a much narrower zone of tolerance than somebody who hasn't, simply because their expectations are based on greater experience. Competition and marketing communication can change expectations and therefore the zone of tolerance. So communications about new offerings of mobile service providers, competition in this area can also often change the zone of tolerance and expectations. That is, that I can upgrade my handset, or that my phone works every time, or that I've got a 3G versus a 4G handset. Your experience as well, and the situation. So an urgent situation where you need to call home, obviously the mobile phone will be more important when you need to call home an emergency, or you have a different zone of tolerance for waiting to go and see a general practitioner than if you're going to an emergency services. So this will change the zone of tolerance. Also, this shows you how the following diagram, which is 10.3 in your text, also shows you how the zone of tolerance can change for level or expectation here between two types of service. View of the tangibles, and you can see the zone of tolerance is a little bit wider here, or the reliability of a service where it's slightly narrower, and of course the zone of tolerance here has moved up. So basically this is saying that it will vary for different aspects of the service as well as just the service provider. What then influences expectations of a service? Well, sources of desired service expectations may be influenced by the following: your personal needs and your personal service philosophy. So this might be this really gets back to your personality, I suppose. your tolerance for people making mistakes, your acceptance of things going wrong, or your demands that things should be done at a very high level. And that's really boils down to your personality. Your personal needs, of course, your needs and wants. Clearly, if you've got a disabled child, your level of desired service expectations from a medical practitioner are significantly higher than if you're going there yourself. Sources of adequate service expectations, what is just considered reasonable, really has to do again with what we call temporary service intensifiers or situational factors which might make something important. So clearly if you're wanting to talk to somebody about an urgent financial transaction, you don't want to wait. You want a reaction or a resolution to the problem. If you're thinking or planning ahead for a holiday, you probably can wait for some feedback to come back before you book the holiday. The role of the customer's perceived role, their expertise, their involvement in the co-production of the service will also influence adequate service expectations. So my adequate service expectations for managing a broadband connection might be different to that of other people in my family, just given my role in setting up that and my expertise. Obviously situational factors, and you can think of things like getting married, going on a very important date, a very important business appointment, family holiday when you're really tired. These situational factors will make what's an adequate service expectation much higher. Of course, so what we think the predicted service level. So if I go to McDonald's or if I go to a fast food restaurant, my predicted service level is already pretty not that high. So I will probably put up with lesser service than if I go to a 5-star restaurant or a 5-star hotel. So sources of both desired and predicted expectations come from a number of areas. These are the promises the company or service provider makes. Word of mouth, and of course your previous experience. So these will predict both your expectations and your predicted service. So your desired and what level of service you think you'll get. So here's an example of previous experience and word of mouth as an influence of expectations. And this is from an industry forum called Whirlpool, used by a lot of people to select a broadband provider, in this case the National Broadband Network in Australia. And so people can look at this site and share and have a look at what people's previous experience, and the word of mouth will influence their expectations. Further related to this, there are other factors that influence the desired predicted service which we've talked about here. As I said, organisations can influence customer expectations. Now, they may want to do this to raise the bar, to show that they're better than competition, but they've got to be careful. Experience the fun of Telstra 4G with a free USB. So really what this is implying, that this is easy to use, and this should be 4G. So what happens when you're in an area which doesn't have 4G? Does that mean Telstra has not met its service promise? Customer perceptions are the next stage, or the next thing that we consider when looking at how people judge a service. And there's two important issues here. First is what we often call satisfaction, and service quality. And these are two interchangeable areas, but it's important you work out how these two differ. Both are related. Generally, if people are satisfied when they get good service and dissatisfied when they get bad service. Okay, so that's straightforward. Why they're different? Well, service quality is your overall perception of the firm, the person, the event, while satisfaction is a percentage. Service quality is really an overall perception of the object, okay, which is usually a company, could be a person, and so on. While satisfaction is a perception of a particular service transaction or encounter. Okay. We can also talk about transaction versus cumulative perceptions. Generally, you will form service quality over a number of perceptions, a number of interactions with the service provider. Remember, we talked about this, I think, in lecture 4, where we looked at the service encounter. Emotion is also important in customer satisfaction. Service encounters can be emotional. Think of high stakes service encounters such as attending a hospital with one of your loved ones being injured, birth of your first child, or ending up in a court of law, or a divorce court, or something like that. So in these areas where emotion becomes important, justice and perceived fairness, how you're being treated in respect to how others are treated, is often a very important way that people judge whether they are satisfied with the service delivery. In terms of satisfaction models, there are two broad approaches that have been used. One is the disconfirmation of expectations, so that simply put, if your expectations are met, you're satisfied. If they're less than met, you're dissatisfied. And what we call the European Customer Satisfaction Index, which is really looking at what we often call technical and functional aspects of service quality, of satisfaction, and related them to a model. Okay, so here's what the customer satisfaction model looks like. This has been around for quite some time. Patterson is the reference here, but it really goes back to Oliver in the early 90s. And you can see here we have expectations, performance. If these are met, you're merely satisfied. If they are not met, if performance is less than expectations, are less than performance, or performance is less than expectations, we're dissatisfied. And recall when we talked, I think in lecture 4 or 3, about positive disconfirmation, we call this delight. Okay, often unexpected. The European Customer Satisfaction Index takes a different view. Here this model is looking at customer satisfaction as being driven by value, which then impacts on loyalty. So what influences value? Image or reputation, your expectations, the perceived quality of the hardware, this is often called technical, and the perceived quality of the human aware, which is called functional. Alright, so that all sounds very theoretical. Here's how it works in practice. Here's some research I was involved with a few years ago, under a previous name, with one of the textbook authors. The technical quality here is the aspects of the backpacker's room, price. Functional quality is the personal service, and you can see that that satisfaction is determined by perceived value, which in turn is delivered by price, technical quality, and reputation, right? And image, of course, affects loyalty to some extent, but satisfaction then drives future loyalty. That's whether somebody would stay in the backpackers hotel. So functional quality here, how you're treated in the backpackers hostel, doesn't drive value, but it's important of whether you're satisfied and therefore will come back. So what's some of the ways of measuring customer satisfaction? Well, in order to meet customer, one does have to measure it. Many organisations will use what's called the Net Promoter Score, or NPS, to measure customer satisfaction. Here we simply ask people on a score of 0 to 10 how likely they are to recommend the service provider to friends. So it's kind of a loyalty measure, but it's also used. And we subtract those less than 4 from those above 7 to work out what we call the Net Promoter Score. One method is to identify motivational drivers behind satisfaction as laddering. And here, while it's one thing to ask people whether they're satisfied with the service, it's also important to know which parts of the service they are satisfied or dissatisfied with, so that we can take corrective action. And so laddering here aims to connect customer needs and wants with respect to satisfaction with the service attributes of the firm. And there's a nice example given in your text. Okay, so secure transactions is a customer requirement. What does that mean? Well, it means government and access to account information, accessibility, flexible operating hours. So these are the satisfaction measures, and these are the laddering that needs to be done to meet them. Cost benefits and so on. So you can see here why laddering of asking an additional performance measure here, or which part of the service is important in terms of improving customer satisfaction within an organisation. So satisfaction and loyalty, if you're happy, does it lead to loyalty? Well, the answer is perhaps. We think there's a curvilinear relationship. Generally, it's been shown that if you're dissatisfied, you will eventually leave. But there is a threshold level where people do think about leaving, and it also depends upon whether there are good competitive offerings in the marketplace or whether people face switching costs. So the next aspect we looked at is service quality. Now, of course, service quality sounds, we've established that it is the overall view of the service provider, but how do we define quality? Well, we can say this is a transcendent view, that quality is some innate characteristic of innate excellence. Or it may be based on a product or service. A high quality restaurant service is this. A high quality, so we're getting back a little bit to expectations and performance. Users can also have their own different definitions of defining quality. So my definition of defining quality for an airline trip might be different to your definition of defining quality. Or it can, generally these days, it's related to the level of service performance that people receive. Now, there are a number of service quality dimensions, and we'll talk about those later. So what we find is that generally we can't measure service quality with one overall measure. We need to look at all the aspects of the service, and so that's something that we'll discuss in a minute. In identifying gaps in service quality, there are 4 potential provider gaps that may occur within the organisation. The first is not knowing what customers expect, and we can call this a provider gap number 1. We'll look at a model of this in a minute. Second one is specifying standards that do not accurately reflect what management believes to be customer expectations. So management doesn't understand what expectations are. Service performance also does not match specifications. That's another provider gap that we can look at in terms of service quality, and not living up to the levels of service performance that are promoted and promised by marketing communications, which is the 4th gap. So this kind of model looks something similar like this. So here's our gaps that we talked about: the company expectations, okay, the gap between customer-driven service and standard delivery, and company expectations and service delivery. Now, why is this important? To try and identify where the gaps in the company delivering service quality is, and to therefore take corrective action. Some perception or dimensions of service quality are listed here, and these include professionalism and skills, the attitudes and behaviours of people, often called empathy, accessibility and flexibility of the service provider. Reliability and trustworthiness are also important dimensions, being able to recover when things go wrong for a service provider, and the overall reputation and credibility. Now, that's sort of face-to-face services generally, or those over a telephone. We can also have what's called e-service quality, which is a little bit different, because people use this to judge websites and really the technology they experience, and hopefully with no questions or problems. So they can look at efficiency, fulfillment, order fulfillment, reliability. Privacy comes in as another important aspect of e-service quality, as does how responsive you are, compensation for anything going wrong, and the ability to contact somebody when help is needed. So as you can see, quite a number of approaches here in satisfaction and quality. The important thing just to remember is that they are related but quite different. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Thanks for your time.